In an affluent suburb where perfectly manicured lawns meet unspoken prejudices, one phone call shatters the illusion of progressive harmony. When Sarah Henderson dials 911 to report a suspicious person, she sets in motion events that will force her entire community to confront its deepest biases. But what the responding officers discover isn't a crime in progress. It's a 15-year-old boy with a dream and a piano, carrying a truth that will change everything. Sarah Henderson stood at her bay window, peering through the gauzy curtains at the figure across the street. Her manicured fingers drummed against the windowsill as she watched the young man in a dark hoodie walking slowly past the houses in her affluent suburb of Maple Grove. The teenager seemed to be looking down at his phone, occasionally stopping to check something, then continuing his careful pace down the street. "This isn't right," she muttered to herself, reaching for her phone. "Not in this neighborhood." The boy couldn't have been more than 15 or 16, but something about his presence made Sarah's heart race. She'd lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, served as the HOA president for 8 of those, and she knew everyone who belonged here. This boy definitely didn't. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Yes, hello. Sarah spoke in a hushed voice, though she was alone in her house. There's a suspicious person walking down Maple Avenue. He's been going up and down the street for the last 10 minutes, looking at houses. I think he might be casing the neighborhood. Can you describe this person? Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second. Young male, African American, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He keeps stopping in front of houses and looking around. Has he done anything threatening? Well, no, but... Is he carrying any weapons that you can see? No, but he doesn't belong here. I know everyone in this neighborhood. The dispatcher's voice remained professional, but took on a slightly different tone. Ma'am, we'll send an officer to check it out. Please stay on the line. Outside, Marcus Thompson was growing increasingly frustrated. The app on his phone kept recalculating, and he was pretty sure he was in the right area, but the house numbers weren't matching up with what his client had given him. This was his first day working for TaskRunner, an app that connected people with odd jobs and errands, and he was determined to make a good impression. His mother had been hesitant about him taking the job. "Baby, you're only 15. Maybe you should wait until you're older," she'd said. But Marcus had been persistent. He wanted to save up for a laptop for college, and he'd convinced her that doing simple errands like grocery shopping and yard work would be safe enough. Now, standing in this upscale neighborhood, with its perfectly manicured lawns and luxury cars in every driveway, he was starting to feel out of place. He'd noticed the woman watching him from her window a few houses back, but he'd tried to ignore it. It wasn't the first time he'd been viewed with suspicion, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Officer David Chen was the first to respond to the call. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, he immediately spotted the teenager described in the dispatch. But something about the scene didn't match the urgency of the call. The boy wasn't skulking or hiding. He was standing in plain view on the sidewalk, clearly focused on his phone. Chen pulled his patrol car alongside the teenager. "Afternoon," he called out through his open window. Marcus looked up, his heart sinking when he saw the police car. He'd been warned about this too, by his parents, his older siblings, his teachers. "Keep your hands visible. Don't make any sudden movements. Stay calm." "Hello, officer," he responded, making sure his phone was clearly visible in his hand. Mind telling me what you're doing in the neighborhood?" "Yes, sir. I work for TaskRunner," Marcus explained, turning his phone screen toward the officer. "I'm trying to find 1247 Maple Avenue to deliver some groceries, but the app keeps sending me in circles." A second patrol car pulled up behind Officer Chen's vehicle, and Marcus felt his anxiety spike. He forced himself to take slow, steady breaths, just like his father had taught him. Meanwhile, Sarah watched the scene unfold from her window, her hand pressed against her chest. This wasn't exactly how she'd expected things to go. The boy seemed so normal, professional even. She found herself hoping she hadn't made a terrible mistake. Officer Chen stepped out of his car, but his body language was relaxed. He approached Marcus with an easy stride, glancing at the phone screen. 1247 Maple? That's actually 1 block over. This is Maple Avenue, but you want Maple Drive. They renamed half the street last year, but some apps haven't updated yet. The second officer, Jessica Martinez, had also exited her vehicle and was walking toward them. She'd responded to similar calls before, and something in her gut told her this one would turn out to be just as unnecessary. "TaskRunner, huh?" Officer Martinez said, joining the conversation. My sister uses that app all the time. How long have you been working for them? This is my first day, actually, Marcus admitted, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I'm trying to save up for college. Sarah couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the officers' relaxed postures, the way they were engaging with the boy in conversation rather than confrontation. Shame began to creep up her neck, coloring her cheeks. Inside her house, her phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood watch app she'd helped establish. A message from her neighbor, 3 doors down. Just got a notification that my task runner delivery is nearby. First time using the service. Has anyone else tried it? Sarah's hands began to shake as she read the message. She looked back out the window, where Officer Chen was now pointing down the street, seemingly giving directions. The boy, no, the young man, was nodding, looking relieved. Mrs. Jenkins, Sarah's elderly neighbor from across the street, had come out onto her porch. She walked over to the small group, her cane tapping against the sidewalk. Sarah watched as Mrs. Jenkins joined the conversation, her face lighting up with what appeared to be recognition. Through her cracked window, Sarah could now hear fragments of their conversation. Thompson's boy, Mrs. Jenkins was saying. I should have known. How's your mother doing? She helped me set up my internet last month. The pieces were starting to come together in Sarah's mind, each one landing like a weight in her stomach. She remembered now. Her book club friend Janet Thompson had mentioned her son starting a new job, proud of his entrepreneurial spirit. Janet Thompson, who ran the youth ministry at their church. Janet Thompson, who had helped organize the neighborhood's last 3 food drives. Officer Martinez had taken out her own phone and appeared to be showing Marcus something on the screen. The boy was smiling now, his earlier tension forgotten as he engaged with the small group that had formed around him. Sarah watched as Mrs. Jenkins patted Marcus's arm and pointed toward Maple Drive, adding her own directions to Officer Chen's. The scene before her was so far removed from the suspicious activity she'd reported that she felt physically ill. In her hand, her phone buzzed again. Another neighborhood watch notification. Just had my groceries delivered by the most polite young man from Task Runner. Anyone else using this service? It's amazing. The weight in Sarah's stomach grew heavier. She thought about her own son, away at college now. How would she feel if someone had called the police on him for simply doing his job? How many times had he walked through neighborhoods, looking at his phone, trying to find a friend's house? Outside, the gathering was breaking up. Marcus was thanking the officers and Mrs. Jenkins, his phone now correctly directed to his destination. Officer Chen was returning to his patrol car, while Officer Martinez lingered, apparently sharing one final piece of advice. Sarah realized she needed to do something. But what? An apology seemed simultaneously absolutely necessary and woefully insufficient. She thought about Janet Thompson, who she would likely see at book club next week. What would she say to her? How could she explain what she'd done? More importantly, what did this say about her? She'd always considered herself progressive, open-minded. She donated to the right causes, attended diversity seminars at work, had friends of different backgrounds. Yet here she was, having just called the police on a teenager for the crime of being black in her neighborhood. The sound of engines starting snapped her attention back to the street. The patrol cars were pulling away, and Marcus was walking in the correct direction now, his phone held confidently in front of him. Mrs. Jenkins was making her way back to her house, pausing occasionally to rest on her cane. Sarah stepped back from the window, her reflection in the glass catching her eye. The face that stared back at her looked different somehow. Older, smaller, more uncertain. She had decisions to make now about what kind of person she was, and more importantly, what kind of person she wanted to be. Through her window, she could see Marcus disappearing around the corner, heading toward his actual destination. He moved with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was, because he did belong there, just as much as anyone else. The empty street seemed to mock her now, its peaceful suburban quiet masking the complexity of what had just transpired. A bird landed on her front lawn, pecking at the perfectly manicured grass, oblivious to the human drama that had just played out. Sarah's phone buzzed once more in her hand. This time, it was a text from Janet Thompson. Just heard from Marcus that he made his first task runner delivery in our neighborhood. So proud of him for taking initiative. He's such a good kid. The words blurred as Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She had some serious soul-searching to do, and she knew this was just the beginning. The question was, where would she go from here? In the distance, she could hear the sound of more task runner notifications pinging from various houses along the street. The app was catching on in the neighborhood, it seemed. Change was coming to Maple Avenue, whether Sarah Henderson was ready for it or not. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across her living room floor, Sarah remained rooted to her spot by the window, watching as life continued to unfold on her street. A street that suddenly felt both familiar and foreign, like a photograph that had been slightly altered while she wasn't looking. She thought about Marcus making his way to his delivery destination, unaware of the turmoil he'd inadvertently sparked in her mind. She thought about Officer Chen and Officer Martinez, who had handled the situation with such professional grace. She thought about Mrs. Jenkins, who had unwittingly shown her what it meant to be a true neighbor. But mostly she thought about herself and the long road ahead of her. Because while the incident itself might have been over, she knew that this was really just the beginning of a much longer story. Sarah Henderson stood at her bay window, peering through the gauzy curtains at the figure across the street. Her manicured fingers drummed against the windowsill as she watched the young man in a dark hoodie walking slowly past the houses in her affluent suburb of Maple Grove. The teenager seemed to be looking down at his phone, occasionally stopping to check something, then continuing his careful pace down the street. The next morning, Sarah sat at her kitchen island, staring into her coffee cup as if it might hold answers to questions she hadn't even fully formed yet. Her husband, James, had already left for his law firm downtown, blissfully unaware of yesterday's events. She hadn't found the courage to tell him. Her phone lay face down on the granite countertop. She'd been avoiding it since waking up, knowing that the Neighborhood Watch app would be buzzing with discussions about Task Runner and its new presence in their community. But more than that, she was avoiding the text she knew she needed to write to Janet Thompson. The doorbell rang, startling her out of her reverie. Through the front door's decorative glass panels, she could see Mrs. Jenkins' familiar silhouette. Sarah's stomach tightened. Had the elderly woman recognized her curtains yesterday? Did she know who had made the call? With trembling fingers, Sarah opened the door. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Jenkins said, her face kind but knowing. "I thought we might have a chat." Sarah stepped aside, gesturing for her neighbor to enter. Mrs. Jenkins had been living in the neighborhood for over 40 years, long before it had become the exclusive enclave it was now. She'd watched the demographic shifts, the tear-downs of modest homes to make way for mini mansions, the gradual homogenization of their community. "I made coffee," Sarah offered weakly, leading the way to the kitchen. "Wonderful," Mrs. Jenkins replied, settling onto one of the island stools with practiced ease. She waited until Sarah had poured her a cup before speaking again. "You know, I remember when Janet Thompson's family first moved on to Cedar Lane. Must have been, 20 years ago now." Sarah's hands froze in the act of passing the cream. "There were some who weren't too happy about it at the time," Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice matter of fact. 3 different people called the police that first week, reporting suspicious activity. Would you believe one of them called just because Janet's husband was jogging? I didn't know," Sarah managed to say. "No, you wouldn't have. You weren't here then. And Janet never knew either. That's part of the problem, isn't it? The calls happen, the police come, and then everyone goes about their business as if nothing happened. But something did happen. Something always happens." Sarah sank onto the stool across from Mrs. Jenkins, her coffee forgotten. "Did you know yesterday, when you saw Marcus, that someone had called? Of course. I may be old, but I'm not blind. 2 police cars don't show up for a simple delivery service mix-up." Mrs. Jenkins took a sip of her coffee. "And I saw you in your window." The shame that had been simmering in Sarah's chest threatened to overflow. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "Yes, you do," Mrs. Jenkins replied firmly. "You're just afraid to do it." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed. This time, she couldn't ignore it. It was a message from Janet. "Book club meeting moved to my house tonight. Everyone's bringing dinner for Marcus to celebrate his first week of work. Hope you can make it." Mrs. Jenkins watched as Sarah read the message, her expression unreadable. "You know, dear, life has a funny way of giving us exactly the opportunities we need, right when we need them." Outside, the morning sun had risen fully, casting bright squares of light across Sarah's kitchen floor. A task runner car drove past her house, its driver confidently navigating the street that had confused Marcus yesterday. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of a moving truck, another new family joining their community. "What happened yesterday," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, "doesn't have to define you, but what you do today, that will." Sarah looked up from her phone, tears pricking at her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Mrs. Jenkins replied. "That means you understand the weight of it. Now, what are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air between them, as heavy as the summer humidity outside. Through her kitchen window, Sarah could see children gathering at the bus stop, a mix of faces and families that hadn't existed in the neighborhood when she'd first moved in. The community was changing. The question was, could she? Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from TaskRunner. "Rate your experience with our service." The app obviously didn't know that she'd never actually used it, that her only interaction with it had been as a source of unfounded suspicion. Mrs. Jenkins reached across the island and patted Sarah's hand. "You know, I'm having some groceries delivered later this week. My arthritis makes it hard to carry the heavy bags. I was thinking of using that TaskRunner service everyone's talking about." The meaning behind her words was clear. This wasn't just about one incident, or one afternoon, or one misguided phone call. This was about the countless small decisions that people made every day. Decisions that either reinforced walls or helped to tear them down. Sarah took a deep breath, picked up her phone, and began to type. The book club message could wait. First, she had another message to write, one that was much more important and much more difficult. "Dear Marcus," she began, then stopped. How did one even begin to apologize for something like this? How could words possibly bridge the gap between intention and impact, between casual prejudice and real harm? Mrs. Jenkins sat quietly, sipping her coffee, offering the gift of her presence without the burden of her judgment. Outside, the neighborhood continued its morning routine, unaware of the small but significant transformation taking place in Sarah Henderson's kitchen. After several attempts, Sarah finally had a draft of her message to Marcus that felt honest, if inadequate. "Dear Marcus, you don't know me, but I'm the person who called the police yesterday when you were trying to make your delivery. There is no excuse for what I did, and I'm deeply sorry. My actions came from a place of prejudice that I'm only now beginning to fully recognize. I would very much like the opportunity to apologize to you in person, but I also understand if you're not comfortable with that. If you are willing, I would like to speak with your mother as well. What I did was wrong, and I need to take responsibility for it." Her finger hovered over the send button. "Read it to me," Mrs. Jenkins said gently. Sarah did, her voice trembling slightly. "Good," the older woman nodded. "It's direct, honest, no excuses. Send it." Sarah pressed send before she could change her mind. Almost immediately, she felt a wave of panic. What if he shows it to everyone? What if it ends up on social media? What if it does? Mrs. Jenkins interrupted. Would that be worse than what you did? The question stopped Sarah short. She thought about Marcus, how he must have felt seeing those police cars pull up. How many times had this happened to him before? How many times would it happen again? Her phone buzzed. Another message from Janet. "Sarah, haven't heard back about tonight. We're starting at 7. Marcus mentioned meeting one of our neighbors yesterday. Said the police helped him find the right street. Do you know anything about that?" Sarah's hands began to shake. Of course Marcus would have mentioned it to his mother. He probably hadn't said anything about the police call, though. He seemed like the kind of young man who wouldn't want to worry his mother. "I need to go see Janet," Sarah said suddenly, standing up. "Before the book club. I need to tell her in person." Mrs. Jenkins nodded approvingly. "Would you like me to come with you?" Sarah shook her head. "No, this is something I need to do myself." The drive to Cedar Lane was only 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Sarah had been to Janet's house countless times for book club, but it looked different today. She noticed things she'd never paid attention to before: the mathematical competition trophies visible through the front window, the carefully tended roses that Janet's husband David kept in pristine condition, the honor student bumper sticker on their car, all the markers of a family that was living the same upper-middle-class life as everyone else in the neighborhood. A family she had never fully seen before. As she pulled into the driveway, her phone buzzed. It was a reply from Marcus. "Mrs. Henderson, thank you for your message. I appreciate your honesty. My mom always says that acknowledging our mistakes is the first step to fixing them. I would be willing to meet with you. Maybe at tonight's book club. I'll be home studying anyway." Sarah read the message 3 times. The maturity and grace of his response made her feel even worse about her actions. Here was a teenager showing more wisdom and forgiveness than she, a grown woman, had shown judgment and understanding. She was still sitting in her car when Janet came out of the house, wearing gardening gloves and carrying pruning shears. She waved when she saw Sarah, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Sarah, what a nice surprise. Are you here about tonight? I was just about to text you again." Sarah got out of her car on shaky legs. "Janet, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that whatever happens after I tell you, I understand. I need to be honest with you." Janet's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. "Sarah, what's wrong?" In that moment, Sarah realized that this conversation might end their friendship. Janet might never want to speak to her again. She might be asked to leave the book club, might become the subject of neighborhood gossip, might lose the social standing she'd worked so hard to maintain, and she deserved all of it. "Yesterday," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I saw someone walking down our street, someone I didn't recognize, and I called the police." Janet's pruning shears lowered slowly to her side. "Go on," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "It was Marcus," Sarah continued, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "I didn't know it was him. I didn't know he was working for TaskRunner. I just saw a young black man in the neighborhood," Janet finished for her, her voice still eerily calm. Sarah nodded, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. "Yes. And I'm so sorry, Janet. What I did was wrong. It was racist, and it was dangerous. And I need you to know that I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth, and because I need to take responsibility for my actions." Janet stood very still, the morning sun casting shadows across her face. In the distance, a lawnmower started up, the mundane sound a stark contrast to the weight of the moment. "Do you know why we chose this neighborhood?" Janet asked finally, her voice tight with emotion. "Do you know why we paid more than we could really afford at the time to live here?" Sarah shook her head. "Because we thought it would be safer for our children. Because we thought that in an affluent, educated neighborhood, they wouldn't have to deal with exactly what you did to Marcus yesterday." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one deserved, each one true. Janet took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Marcus didn't tell us about the police. He just said someone had helped him find the right street. Do you know why?" Again, Sarah shook her head. "Because he's used to it," Janet said, her voice breaking slightly. "Because David and I have had to teach him since he was 12 years old what to do when, not if, when, someone calls the police on him for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Do you understand what that's like, to have to teach your child that?" Sarah couldn't speak. Her throat felt too tight for words. Janet looked down at the pruning shears in her hands, then back up at Sarah. "You said you're not looking for excuses. Good, because there aren't any. But you're here. You're telling me the truth. That's something." They stood in silence for a long moment, the morning sun growing warmer around them. From inside the house, they could hear the faint sound of Marcus playing piano, a classical piece that Sarah recognized but couldn't name. "He's practicing for his college auditions," Janet said softly. "Juilliard is his dream school. The TaskRunner job is for his plane ticket to the audition. He didn't want us to have to pay for it." Each new piece of information about Marcus felt like another indictment of Sarah's actions, another reminder of how completely she had misjudged everything about that moment yesterday. The piano music from inside the house swelled, the notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floating through the morning air. Sarah recognized it now. It was the same piece her own son had struggled with years ago before giving up piano altogether. "The book club meeting tonight," Janet said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "Were you planning to come?" I wasn't sure if I should." Janet studied her for a long moment. "You know, it would be easier for everyone if you didn't come. Easier for you to avoid the discomfort. Easier for me to not have to think about it. Easier for Marcus to not have to face you." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But maybe easy isn't what we need right now." Before Sarah could respond, the front door opened and Marcus stepped out. He was wearing a Juilliard t-shirt and carrying his phone, completely unaware of the tension in the driveway. "Mom, Mrs. Jenkins just called. She wants to know if I can help her with her TaskRunner app setup before—" He stopped short when he saw Sarah, recognition flickering across his face. Sarah felt rooted to the spot, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected to face him so soon. "Marcus," Janet said, her voice carefully controlled. "This is Mrs. Henderson. She just came by to talk to me about what happened yesterday." Marcus straightened his shoulders, looking far older than his 15 years. "I got your message," he said to Sarah, his voice steady. "I meant what I said about being willing to talk." Sarah found herself marveling at his composure, his dignity in the face of her indignity. "I meant what I said too," she managed to say, "about being sorry, about wanting to make it right." "Making it right isn't just about apologizing," Marcus said thoughtfully. "It's about changing. My dad always says that." "Your dad is a wise man," Janet said softly. "He also says that change doesn't happen in isolation," Marcus continued. "It happens in community." He glanced at his mother, then back at Sarah. "That's why I think you should come tonight, to the book club." Janet reached out and squeezed her son's shoulder, pride and pain mingling in her expression. Sarah felt overwhelmed by their grace, their willingness to create space for her growth, even after her actions had threatened their sense of safety and belonging. "I don't deserve this kindness," she whispered. "No, you don't," Marcus agreed candidly. "But this isn't about what you deserve. It's about what kind of community we want to build." A car drove past Janet's house, slowing slightly as the driver noticed the three of them standing in the driveway. Sarah recognized Mrs. Parker from 2 streets over, another book club member. No doubt the story would be circulating soon, if it wasn't already. "I should go," Sarah said, suddenly aware of how long she'd been standing there. "I have some thinking to do before tonight." Janet nodded. 7 o'clock. We're discussing The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. Somehow seems even more relevant now. As Sarah turned to leave, Marcus spoke up again. "Mrs. Henderson, would you mind if I played something for you tonight, before the book club starts?" Sarah turned back, surprised. I'd be honored." "It's a piece I'm working on for my audition," he said. "It's about transformation, about becoming something new while still acknowledging where you came from." The metaphor wasn't lost on any of them. As Sarah drove home, her mind was spinning. She thought about the book they were supposed to discuss tonight, a story about identity, race, and the choices people make that echo through generations. She thought about Marcus's offer to play for her, an act of such profound generosity that it made her chest ache. But mostly she thought about Janet's words. Maybe easy isn't what we need right now. When she got home, she found Mrs. Jenkins still sitting in her kitchen, as if she'd known Sarah would need her when she returned. The older woman took one look at her face and stood up. "Come on," she said, picking up her cane. "We're going to set up my TaskRunner account, and then we're going to talk about what it really means to be a neighbor." Outside, the morning had given way to afternoon, and Sarah could see more TaskRunner vehicles moving through the neighborhood. Change was coming, ready or not. And tonight, in Janet Thompson's living room, she would have to face it head-on. The afternoon passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Mrs. Jenkins had stayed with Sarah for hours, helping her work through what she might say at the book club meeting. They had also set up the TaskRunner app on Mrs. Jenkins' phone, and Sarah had found herself studying the faces of each delivery person who appeared on the screen, confronting her own reactions to them. By 6:30, Sarah stood in front of her closet, trying to decide what to wear. It seemed like such a trivial concern, and yet nothing felt right. Everything in her wardrobe suddenly seemed like armor, the carefully curated outfits she wore to prove she belonged in this neighborhood, in this social circle. Finally, she chose a simple blue dress she hadn't worn in years. No statement jewelry, no designer shoes. Tonight wasn't about maintaining appearances. She arrived at Janet's house at 6:50, intentionally early, as Mrs. Jenkins had suggested. Through the front window, she could see Marcus at the piano, practicing. The same window she'd noticed the trophies through that morning now seemed to frame a different story entirely. Before she could ring the doorbell, David Thompson opened the door. Janet's husband was still in his work clothes. He was a federal judge, Sarah remembered, though she'd never really thought about what that meant for him as a black man in their predominantly white profession. "Sarah," he said, his expression neutral but evaluating. "Janet told me you came by this morning. That was brave." "Not as brave as you and Janet have had to be," she responded quietly. Something in his face softened slightly. "Come in. Marcus is warming up." The living room had been arranged for the book club meeting, chairs and sofas positioned in a circle. The piano, a beautiful baby grand, dominated one corner of the room. Sarah noticed a folder on the music stand labeled Juilliard Audition Pieces. Marcus looked up as she entered, his fingers never stopping their dance across the keys. He was playing scales now, each note precise and intentional. Sarah remembered Janet's words from that morning. He's used to it. Even now he was having to be perfect, having to prove himself. Mrs. Henderson, he nodded, finishing his scale with a flourish. I'd like to play something for you, if that's okay. Please, she said, sinking into a chair near the piano. David took a seat across the room, his presence both supportive and watchful. From the kitchen, Sarah could hear Janet moving around, preparing for the other book club members who would arrive soon. Marcus took a deep breath and began to play. The piece started softly, almost tentatively, like morning light creeping over the horizon. Sarah didn't recognize it, but she felt it. The hesitation, the questioning, the gradual building of something new. As the music swelled, Janet came to stand in the doorway. The three of them sat in silence as Marcus played, his body swaying slightly with the emotion of the piece. The music spoke of struggle and hope, of pain and possibility, of the difficult space between what was and what could be. The doorbell rang, but Janet made no move to answer it. The piece was building now, Marcus's fingers flying across the keys with increasing intensity. Through the window, Sarah could see other book club members arriving, gathering on the porch, but no one interrupted. The music reached a crescendo, then began to transform. The melody that had been questioning became answering. The harmony that had been searching found its resolution. When Marcus played the final notes, letting them linger in the air, Sarah realized she was crying. That was Metamorphosis by Philip Glass, Marcus said into the silence that followed. It's about change, about how it's never easy and it's never finished, but it's always possible. The doorbell rang again, and this time Janet moved to answer it. As she opened the door, the usual chattering of the book club members died away. They must have seen Sarah sitting there, must have heard the music, must have felt the weight in the air. Come in, everyone, Janet said warmly. Marcus just gave us the perfect introduction to tonight's discussion. The other women filed in. Mrs. Parker, who had driven by the morning, Lisa Chen, who ran the neighborhood watch program, Rebecca Martinez, who had recently moved in, and 5 others. Some avoided looking at Sarah, others stared openly. They all knew. Of course they knew. Before we start discussing the book, Janet said once everyone was seated, Sarah has something she'd like to say to all of you. Sarah stood, her legs shaking. She looked at Marcus, still seated at the piano, at David in his judge's suit, at Janet, who had somehow found the strength to create this space for growth instead of shame. She thought about Mrs. Jenkins, who had shown her what it meant to be a true neighbor. Yesterday, she began, her voice quavering but growing stronger. I did something inexcusable, something that exposed not just my own prejudices, but a deeper problem in our community. Behind her, Marcus began to play again, very softly. A gentle accompaniment to her confession, her apology, her commitment to change. The melody was different now, but it carried the same message. Transformation was possible, but only if you were brave enough to face the truth about yourself first. Through the window, the summer evening was fading into dusk, casting long shadows across Janet's living room floor. In the distance, a task runner car turned onto Cedar Lane, its driver unaware of the small but significant metamorphosis taking place inside this house, in this room, in this moment. The room fell silent when Sarah finished speaking, the only sound Marcus's gentle playing in the background. She remained standing, feeling exposed but somehow lighter, as if naming her actions had begun to lift a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. Lisa Chen was the first to speak. I think we all need to examine our use of the Neighborhood Watch program. Her voice was hesitant but determined. I've been running it for 3 years, and I've never once questioned the criteria people use to report suspicious activity. I deleted the app this morning, Mrs. Parker admitted quietly, after I drove by and saw you all in the driveway. It made me think about how many times I've reported people just because they didn't fit my idea of who belongs here. Rebecca Martinez leaned forward in her chair. When we first moved in last month, someone reported my brother to the police. He was helping us unload the moving truck. I never said anything because, she paused, swallowing hard, because I didn't want to be that person who made everything about race. No, Janet said firmly. We've been making everything about race all along. We just pretended we weren't. David Thompson stood up, adjusting his tie. If I may, I'd like to share something. Yesterday, when Marcus told us about his encounter with the police, I felt relief. Relief that he had handled it well, that the officers had been professional, that nothing bad had happened. And then I felt angry. Not at you, Sarah, because I didn't know it was you then, but at myself, for feeling grateful that my son had successfully navigated a situation he should never have been in. Marcus's playing grew slightly louder, the melody weaving through his father's words like a counter-narrative, speaking what couldn't be said. Every morning, David continued, I put on this suit, I go to work, I make rulings on complex legal issues. But before I leave, I still give my son the same talk my father gave me. Keep your hands visible, speak respectfully, move slowly, don't argue, even here, in our own neighborhood. Sarah sank back into her chair, the full weight of her actions pressing down on her. Her one phone call hadn't just been about Marcus. It had reinforced the need for those painful conversations in Black households across their community. I think, Janet said, picking up the book they were supposed to discuss, that we need to talk about why we chose this book. The Vanishing Half isn't just about passing for white. It's about the choices we make about identity, about belonging, about who gets to feel safe and why. The other book club members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were used to discussing these issues in the abstract, as literary themes rather than lived experiences. Mom, Marcus said, his fingers still moving across the keys. Maybe you should tell them about the other houses we looked at before choosing this one. Janet took a deep breath. We looked at 37 houses, not because we couldn't find one we liked, but because we needed to find one on a street with enough lighting, with clear sight lines to the neighbors, with multiple escape routes. She paused, letting that sink in. We chose this house because it seemed safest, and then we spent years trying to prove we belonged here. But you shouldn't have had to, Sarah found herself saying. None of that should have been necessary. No, Janet agreed. It shouldn't have been, but acknowledging that is just the beginning. Lisa Chen pulled out her phone. I'm stepping down as neighborhood watch coordinator, she announced. I'd like to propose we transform it into something else. Maybe a genuine community support network, one that brings people together instead of fostering suspicion. I could help with that, Marcus offered, his music softening. Through TaskRunner, I'm meeting a lot of neighbors who could use support. Elderly residents who need help with groceries, busy parents who could use after-school pickup assistance, people who just moved in and don't know the area yet. The room grew quiet again as Marcus played the final notes of his piece. In the silence that followed, Sarah could hear the sound of more TaskRunner notifications from several phones. The app that had sparked this crisis was now offering a path toward healing. Sarah, Janet said gently, would you be willing to share your story at the next community association meeting? Not to shame you, but to help others understand the impact of these casual calls to the police. Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Parker spoke up. I'll share mine too, about the times I've called unnecessarily. We can't be the only ones. One by one, other women in the room began to nod, some wiping away tears, others pulling out phones to delete apps or make notes. The book lay forgotten on Janet's lap. The story they needed to discuss was unfolding right here in this room. Marcus began a new piece, this one more hopeful, more forward-looking. Through the window, Sarah could see other neighbors walking past, some slowing to peer in at the unusual sight of the book club in obvious emotional discussion. She wondered how many of them had their own stories to tell, their own reckonings to face. The summer night was settling in now, fireflies beginning to blink in Janet's front yard. In the distance, a TaskRunner car pulled up to Mrs. Jenkins' house. She had placed her first order, right on schedule. The neighborhood was changing, not just in its demographics, but in its understanding of itself. But they were only at the beginning. As the book club meeting drew to a close, no one seemed eager to leave. The usual rushed departures with quick goodbyes were replaced by small clusters of women deep in conversation. Marcus had moved from the piano to sit between his parents, his presence a reminder of why this night mattered so much. The community association meeting is next Thursday, Lisa Chen was saying to a small group. I've already contacted the board about adding this to the agenda. We need to talk about concrete changes. Rebecca Martinez pulled up a calendar on her phone. My brother, the one who was reported during our move, He's actually a diversity consultant for corporations. Maybe he could help facilitate the discussion. That would be excellent, David Thompson said. And if I may suggest, we should invite Officers Chen and Martinez from yesterday. They handled the situation well, but they might have insights on how often these calls happen in our neighborhood. Sarah watched these conversations unfold, struck by how quickly people were moving from acknowledgement to action. Her phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Jenkins. My task runner delivery just arrived. The young lady who brought my groceries told me she's nervous about making night deliveries in our neighborhood. We have work to do, dear. Janet appeared at Sarah's side, holding 2 cups of tea. There's something else you should know, she said quietly, handing Sarah one of the cups. Marcus didn't tell you the whole story about his Juilliard audition. Sarah looked over at Marcus, who was now showing Lisa Chen something on the Task Runner app. The audition is in 2 weeks, Janet continued. He's been saving up for the plane ticket, yes, but also because the audition is at night. The only slot they had available is at 7 p.m. She paused, letting Sarah understand the implications. He's been worried about finding his way from the subway to the school in Manhattan after dark, about whether someone might call the police if he looks lost or checks his phone too many times. The teacup trembled in Sarah's hands. That's why he's been practicing delivery routes here first, she whispered. He's not just earning money. He's teaching himself how to move through unfamiliar places safely. Janet nodded. Every time he goes out, David and I hold our breath a little, not because we don't trust him, but because we don't trust the world he has to navigate. She touched Sarah's arm gently. Your call yesterday. It confirmed all his fears about the audition. Across the room, Marcus laughed at something Mrs. Parker had said, the sound bright and young and unburdened. But Sarah could now see the cost of that lightness. The careful calculations behind every move, every gesture, every journey into an unknown space. I want to pay for his plane ticket, Sarah said suddenly. Not as a way to make up for what I did, because nothing can do that, but as an investment in his future, in what he could become if he didn't have to waste so much energy just proving he has the right to exist in spaces. No, Janet said firmly. He needs to earn this himself. But there is something you can do. Anything. Help him practice finding his way around unfamiliar places. You have a sister in Manhattan, don't you, near Lincoln Center? Sarah nodded, understanding dawning. I could connect him with her. She could help him learn the route from the subway to Juilliard before the audition. Maybe even meet him at the station that night. That would mean everything to him, and to us. The conversation in the room had shifted now, with Rebecca's brother on speakerphone, talking about how to structure the community association meeting. Words like systemic change and unconscious bias floated through the air, but they didn't feel like academic concepts anymore. They felt like Marcus's music, deeply personal yet universal. Lisa Chen was creating a new WhatsApp group specifically for coordinating community support. Mrs. Parker was talking about organizing a welcome committee for new residents that would go beyond the usual fruit baskets and restaurant recommendations to include real conversations about inclusion and belonging. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another text from Mrs. Jenkins. Come by tomorrow morning. The young lady who delivered my groceries, she's a student at the local community college studying social work. I think our neighborhood could use a social worker's perspective in all this. Outside, the fireflies were dancing in earnest now, their lights blinking like tiny beacons in the darkness. A task runner car drove slowly past the house, its driver careful to follow all traffic rules, carrying the weight of others' assumptions along with their deliveries. The transformation had begun, but it wouldn't be easy. They were all realizing that change wasn't just about one incident, or one meeting, or one community. It was about the countless small decisions that people make every day. Decisions that could either reinforce walls or help to tear them down. Marcus returned to the piano, his fingers finding the keys without thought. The melody he played now was neither questioning nor answering. It was searching, reaching, becoming. Just like them all. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The community association meeting had drawn the largest attendance in its history, filling the local library's conference room to capacity. Rebecca's brother had facilitated a powerful discussion that left no one unchanged. Officer Chen and Officer Martinez had shared statistics that made many residents uncomfortable. But discomfort, they were learning, was often the first step toward growth. The Neighborhood Watch app had been permanently discontinued, replaced by a community support network that focused on connecting neighbors rather than surveilling them. Mrs. Jenkins' young task runner delivery driver, Angela, had become a regular consultant for their initiatives, bringing her social work perspective to their planning sessions. But the real test came the night before Marcus's Juilliard audition. Sarah's sister had spent the past week helping Marcus practice the route from the subway to the school, sending video updates of his growing confidence navigating the city streets. Yet, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about all the other neighborhoods he would have to pass through, all the other people who might see him as she once had. That's when Janet shared an idea with the community support group chat. On the night of Marcus's departure, he stepped out of his house to find the streets lined with neighbors. They stood in their driveways and on their porches, some holding candles, others simply present. Sarah was there, standing with Mrs. Jenkins, Lisa Chen, Mrs. Parker, Rebecca Martinez. All the book club members and dozens more residents created a path from his front door to the waiting Uber. "What's all this?" Marcus asked, his garment bag containing his performance suit draped carefully over his arm. "This is what community looks like," David Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion, "when it actually works." Janet handed Marcus a small package. Inside was a leather portfolio filled with letters, one from every neighbor who had ever called the police unnecessarily, each sharing their story and their commitment to change. On top was Sarah's letter, which simply read, "Play with all the confidence of someone who never has to question whether they belong." As Marcus's Uber pulled away, the neighbors remained outside, talking quietly among themselves. They weren't just seeing off a young musician to an audition. They were witnessing the birth of something new in their community. The following week would bring the first official meeting of their reorganized neighborhood association, now focused on genuine inclusion and support. Angela would be presenting her proposal for a youth mentorship program. Lisa Chen had already lined up 3 other neighborhoods interested in adopting their new model. Sarah stood with Mrs. Jenkins long after most others had gone inside. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked. The older woman smiled. "Enough? No. We're just getting started. But we've done something real, something that matters." 2 days later, the entire neighborhood received a video clip from Janet. It showed Marcus walking confidently into Juilliard, navigating the nighttime streets of Manhattan without fear. He passed other people checking their phones, other young men in hoodies, other humans simply existing in spaces where they had every right to be. No one called the police. No one questioned his presence. And in the final frame, just before he entered the building, he looked directly at the camera and smiled. The smile of someone who knew exactly where he belonged. The message attached to the video read, "Thank you for helping our son carry music instead of fear into the world. This is just the beginning." Sarah watched the clip a dozen times, remembering that day when she had stood at her window, seeing threat where she should have seen promise. The neighborhood had changed since then, yes, but more importantly, they had all changed with it. They had learned that safety wasn't about surveillance and suspicion. It was about connection and community. That evening, as the sun set over Maple Avenue, the sound of piano music drifted through the air. In houses up and down the street, people paused to listen. It was Marcus, home from his audition, playing Metamorphosis once again. But this time, the questioning notes had been replaced by something stronger, something more assured. This time, it was the sound of transformation complete. And in her living room, Sarah closed her eyes and listened, knowing that while this particular story had found its resolution, the real work of change was just beginning. After all, metamorphosis wasn't just about becoming something new. It was about ensuring that others had the space to do the same. Outside, a task runner car turned onto the street, its driver navigating with the confidence of someone who knew they would be welcomed. The neighborhood had found its new rhythm, one that made room for all the songs yet to be played, all the stories yet to be told, all the changes yet to come.